How would you feel if you got an email out of the blue that said, in a couple of days' time, you'd be unable to ship your flagship product to any of your customers? What would you do? How would you feel? I'm Cail, as you said. I work for a company called Octopus Deploy, where we make a continuous deployment tool. I'm employed as an SRE there, but in our internal build and delivery team, where we manage the tools that help us build, test, and deploy our own product. I also have a special role as DRI for incident management. Doesn't mean I make sure we don't have incidents. It just means that I try and help us be equipped to deal with them when they come up. This happened to us. And I'd like to tell you a story about that. But first I need to talk terminology for a moment. I subtitled this talk Resilience in Action, and we're going to come back to that in a bit more detail at the end. But for now, I'd like to badly misquote Massive Attack and ask that you think of resilience as a doing word. What I mean here is resilience isn't some property that you can measure directly. It's about the interactions between parts of your socio-technical system. Keep that in mind. So I'm going to tell a story, and then we'll zoom out a bit, and I'm going to tell you a story about telling stories. And look, we might even zoom out further. I don't know, but let's see how we go. Back in March of this year, our SecOps manager, security operations, found out that our code signing certificate was going to expire in 4 days' time. Now, this sounds bad. Some of you might be wondering, though, what is a code signing certificate? If you've ever traveled internationally, as I imagine many of you have to get here, you've probably experienced handing a passport to an immigration officer at the border. Now, they're relying on looking at the passport and checking for a number of security features to satisfy themselves that it's legitimate and that it belongs to you. Code signing certificates are a method that let our customers similarly trust that the code they download off the internet was actually produced by us, because these certificates are only issued to organizations that can prove they are who they say they are to a third party. It's worth noting these are a bit different to the certificates you might see on websites. Those you can usually automatically generate from something like Let's Encrypt, who'll give you a certificate that's valid for up to 3 months. Code signing certificates are only issued manually. You've got to get on the phone or send an email to somebody. And they're valid for 1 to 3 years. All right, enough background. Our SecOps manager calls an incident, pulls in some responders from the builds team who work closely with these certificates. Now, this manager had already begun the renewal process at this point, but in mid-2023, a group called the CA Browser Forum finally changed the rules about how private key material was allowed to be stored for code signing certificates. Don't bother trying to read that, it's boring. If you're a certificate nerd, it might be interesting. Maybe there's some here, but anyway. The existing method we were using to store our certificate was not going to qualify under the new rules. Oh dear. Also, the third-party organizational validation we had expired as well, so we need to get that renewed before anyone was going to issue us anything. Work splits into 2 streams. 1, figure out how to meet these new key storage requirements, which our builds team took on, and 2, expedite that organizational validation, which the SecOps manager took on. To whip through the main points in the rest of the response process, organizational validation hits some kind of fraud check. Apparently there's some company out there with a name that's a bit similar to ours doing some dodgy things. Our research finds that a Vault technology that's as similar to what we're using right now should comply. Our compliance team takes a look at this and says, yeah, okay, that'll comply with our cryptography policies, so our ISO compliance is not at risk here. Also looks like it'll comply with what the CA Browser Forum wants, off you go. And SecOps, getting bored of waiting for the fraud sheet to come back, goes and tries another vendor, but we get the same fraud flag again. It's now 3 days to go. 5 minutes before the end of working hours, our SecOps manager gets notified that the issuer will accept a hand-signed attestation, ink on paper, saying that our key storage mechanism will be compliant, and that other than that, organizational validation is cleared, you're ready to go. Now, there's just one problem. Their printer's not working. Now, we're a remote-first organization. This person doesn't live near an office, they don't have any colleagues nearby, so they do something that's kind of incredible. They go and buy a new printer. You can see how happy the staff are about that. Later that night, we get the certificate made available to us. The rest of the work is kind of mechanical to put it into the pipelines, verify it's working. At noon, 2 days before the old one was going to expire, the rotation is complete. Whew. Now, I wasn't a responder, but I attended the retro and looked back through the communication channel to get a sense of how it played out, and I thought some things were interesting. The level of improvisation in this response wasn't spoken about as exceptional. In other words, our organizational culture is already enabling what I'll call adaptation to surprise. Every part of this response took the approach of removing barriers to moving forwards, and capacity was freely made available across some really wide organizational distances. Some examples. Getting the builds team in really early made a big difference in getting this rolling and getting it out the door. Our compliance team, based in very different time zones, made sure that we were not putting our ability to get enterprise customers at risk. And I'll just remind you, someone went and voluntarily bought a printer. That's a huge amount of empowerment. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, how could this have been a surprise? Theoretically, we could have had a better way to be alerted about certificate expiry, but I don't think it's reasonable to expect us to also be proactively monitoring the rules for issuing code signing certificates, considering they're valid for 3 years. I don't think anybody's got time to pay attention to the machinations of the CA browser form over those kinds of durations when it's not a core part of what you do. Without naming any names, also point out that the vendor themselves never notified us of the expiry or the rule change. We found out because the invoice came in. So how could we help this be even less likely in future? I want to zoom out here a bit and talk about learning. Was this an incident at all? There was no interruption to service. We could call it a near miss, maybe a surprise. How do we learn from surprises like this? Someone like me talking at you, telling you what you should learn, what the learnings are? Maybe, probably not though. I sometimes feel like there's this desire to prove we've learned by demonstrating a concrete action. Change some infrastructure, change a process. I'm not sure that's universally true, that that's the only kind of learning. John Allspaw gave a really good talk at LFI-Conf23, Learning from Incidents Conference, saying, amongst other things, that we, and we here is an incident analyst telling you about an incident, cannot control what is learned. I'll quote John, "We can create conditions and situations where people have opportunities to learn something new or better understand something they misunderstood before," end quote. So given that I can't predict or control what you'll learn from this, why am I taking up your time? Resilience. I'm really interested in helping push us towards a future where all of us are given, or even better, have the capacity to seek out the opportunities to learn from surprises. So I thought a story about a near miss involving everyone's favorite piece of technology, a printer, might be a memorable way to solve 2 different problems. One, how to help embed the idea that this specific issue or one a lot like it could happen to you. And we chose not to make a corrective action to commit to monitoring code signing rules, but we did choose to plan to tell this story so that we distribute the knowledge of it having happened as widely as we can. 2, offer an example of a, hopefully, compelling story of a surprise to encourage others to find ways to tell their stories of surprise so that we can all learn together. Now, maybe that doesn't look like a talk like this. There are definitely other ways to tell stories. David Woods refers to a concept of graceful extensibility as a property of a resilient system. Now, this is all about what he terms as units of adaptive behavior, getting additional capacity from other units when they're at capacity. Say, if you're not sure if a certificate storage mechanism will be compliant, but you really need to go buy a printer. Me spending the time preparing and giving this talk is an example of a unit learning out some adaptive capacity in order to better the whole system. So, how can we make our near miss less likely in future? To me, resilience isn't about interesting adaptations. It's about having the capacity to adapt in the first place. So while the first problem, embedding the specific adaptation, has some value, I am way more interested in the second one, making an example of loaning out part of an adaptive unit, in this case my whole company, so that others can benefit. So the final question, how to share stories? Well, step 0 is, if you're not already doing this, talk about incidents inside your organization, outside of your team, but broader than that. Learn from each other. If you have a local meetup, find a local meetup. Start talking about the way things have gone wrong and maybe the way things have gone right as well. If you were here for Courtney's talk the other day, consider contributing your incident reports to the Void. I think it's a unique resource and we should all be contributing to it. And on a personal note, if you're here or you're watching this later and you're from Asia Pacific, I need help. There's very few local events. Please get in touch if you want to put something together. So, let's trade stories, let's trade expertise, let's trade time, and we can all learn together. I need to thank my colleagues for their time and support for helping me put this together. Other people in the Learning from Incidents communities that I'm in for giving me so many resources over the last few years. And I think that especially thank my partner, who's 10 time zones away with 3 young kids, so that I can be here. If you want to compare notes on any of this, you can find me on the conference Slack while I'm here this week, or you can reach me on LinkedIn. Unfortunately, that's my only public social media these days. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take questions if there are any.